Do you know what happened in, say, Pittsburgh or Cincinnati after Scripps closed those papers? Did they set up a similar arrangement with the libraries there, particularly Pittsburgh?
To my knowledge, that didn't happen. I think, Jim, you said this is relatively new territory. And of course, in a lot of those, in cases like Pittsburgh Press in that era, weren't as digital as we were when the Rocky closed. I would imagine that there's some hard copy library archive of clippings and that sort of thing, but probably not nearly to this extent.
I did contact the museum in Washington, D.C. to find out if there was any precedent. They knew of none, where a publisher actually gave not only the archives, but the copyright as well.
Anyone else? Yes, please.
Oh, I was curious what if Scripps' financial consideration was when they were giving these. What was their benefit, if any? Did that come up in the contract negotiation?
As far as the financial benefit, no. They did sell the URL for about $100,000. Now, the next question someone needs to ask, who bought the URL? We had to sign a non-disclosure statement. But then the owner came forward in another way this past year, wanting to actually buy the archives back from the library. And his name is Phil Anschutz.
When you talked about having the archive of the web content as well, but it's a static archive, can you explain a little bit more about what that means?
The way that I understand it is that you will only see the screens as they were originally presented. You won't be able to bounce from screen to screen. And what we don't know at this point is whether or not the video survived. Hi. Okay.
And I can actually answer that.
Okay.
Jim just gave me a disk that had 32 gigabytes of the Rocky Mountain News website on it. So I looked through it, and there are tons of movies on there, movie files, MOV files, as well as MP4 files, sorry. And so we do have a lot of video. How that fits in, whether we can see the exact page and you click on the movie, I don't know if that'll work like that. It may be a separate list of movies. It's a new frontier for us, so.
3 generations from now, the plugins will work because the technology keeps changing. So.
That's a possibility, yeah. And the thing is, we may be able to convert those MOV or MP4 files to another type of files, whatever is going to be in the future.
Other questions?
I have a comment. You know, one of the things that I found was really interesting, or that inspired me, was that Scripps was willing to do this. And I'm comparing that with the paper that I worked at, the Tucson Citizen. And I don't mean to be down on Gannett, because I know they were in, circumstances that were very difficult at the time. But the decision of what to do with the archives at the Tucson Citizen, which went back into the 1880s. It was the longest running newspaper in Arizona. There apparently wasn't time to consider what to do. And, if there had been models or other examples that could have helped that situation, I think it would have improved at least the possibility. As it was, the negotiation went something like this. And this is coming from the editor of the Arizona Daily Star, which was also in a joint operating agreement with the Citizen. And Bobby Joe Buell was at the table with Gannett and said, "So what are you going to do with the Citizen archive?" And the Gannett representative said, "Gee, I don't know." And she said, "Well, we'll take it." And Gannett representative said, "Well, okay then." That was pretty much the way that went down. And then what happened with the digital archive was that apparently the servers were shut down, and then Gannett tried to bring them back up. When they brought them back up, they were broken. The links were broken. There wasn't a good way to know which version of the story you were looking at. Was it the initial draft? Was it the published draft? Links to photos, links to videos were broken. So it points out the fragility, and I think kind of the contrast of how much effort it took for Scripps and Denver Public Library to pull this off. So they really should be applauded.
I have a question for all three of you, I think. With the advantage of 20/20 hindsight, what would you do different with view to preserving the news, either the digital news, the photographs, or anything? What would you as a publisher do different? And what advice would you as the Denver Public Library give to other libraries that might want to acquire a similar archive?
I think it has, from the newsroom side, I think it has to start with having a better sense of history about what you're doing. I mean, somewhere in the mad rush of making deadlines, when you're writing captions, when you're writing information, be as complete as possible. I mean, I know we had a habit, I saw at the Rocky, of photographers in a hurry would paste the same caption into 12 different images, basically. And there's a different person. So it was basically kind of a scene set or an overall caption. When you pick the one you want to use, then we'll rewrite it. But then you've got all these other images that don't have an accurate caption for history. And so I think day in and day out, news gathering operations have to be cognizant of the fact that they are recording history, and they have to do that in a way that years later people can come back and put it together, like all your orphan files you have.
Jim, James?
I think one of the things is that you have to know, once you're going to get the material, the items, the images, whatever they may be in electronic form, that you make sure you have plenty of storage. You also have a place that you know you're going to put it, not just a server in the basement and leave it there. We're lucky, again, like I was saying in my presentation, that we have OCLC as a partner, but we also had to pay for that, so that you need funding. It'd be nice for every library to take a local paper that maybe is going out of business, but you do need funding, and you do need a plan. And so we did have that. I have to give kudos to Jim, because while we were in the process of negotiating, we were also planning with OCLC and making sure we had space for that.
I don't know that I would do anything different. I mean, part of this was driven by ignorance is bliss. I had no idea what I was getting myself into, and when someone asked me, do you want the Rockies archives? I, of course, said yes. And it's been a learning curve ever since.
Questions?
Hey, so I've got a question on the sort of technical end. So how much consultation with the Rocky Mountain News's former technical staff did you have to do, or was that largely done with OCLC to both inventory and figure out what was runnable or not?
It was mostly done with OCLC. What I learned from Randall in those days that we were packing up the Rocky. The staff was gone. As Randall said, within a day, they were out of the office, and we lost all of that institutional memory in one fell swoop.
Was there anything in particular you would have liked to have had from, if you had had a few months prior preparation or something like that, that would have helped the process?
Yes. For example, it wasn't until the 11th hour that I realized that the sports photographs were kept in a different room, in a different way, in boxes, labeled by the name of the professional team. I had no idea. So, as we're shutting down the Rocky, I am quickly trying to load up all these boxes on pallets and get them out of there. So it would have been worthwhile for me to be able to have a discussion with members of the staff to find out exactly what was there. I was telling Randall earlier, I started going through file cabinets, and I found the reporter's notes for the Columbine massacre. And that was just chilling when I opened up the drawer and realized what I had in hand. So those went in a box and on over to the library. Another piece that we found that was a little bit deliberate was John Temple's files. And those, of course, had all of the management, the corporate notes from the last 10 years of the Rocky. Once again, John didn't tell me what he had. I just had to go in and find out. I certainly would have liked to have talked to the IT people to find out how their web page was put together, because in the end, we really didn't know, and we still don't know.
As well as their server, talking to the people that service the server, it would be nice to find out what specific specifications they had for that device, that server. So we didn't have that.
I mean, just hearing what you said, there's always this, when you close a paper, and unfortunately we've closed too many in this country, there's always this rush to get everyone out as quickly as possible. They could do something bad or what have you. And at the same time, there's probably not much willingness to want to hang around either. But I think as this happens, I mean, in hindsight, it would have been great if we could have had some of the web folks, paid them to help you make this transition, explain the technology and the proprietary software behind it, and think of that. I mean, I know John was already thinking ahead of where are we going to go with this archive, and then when that moment happened, there could have been better ways to do that with technical people to help that.
Other questions?
Jim, what did you not keep? What appraisal decisions did you make?
That's a good question. I didn't go into any of the reporters' desks, individual desks, so those were things that right off the bat I didn't keep. There was some material culture that I took over to the Historical Society. We didn't keep the entire Rocky professional library. Many of those items were duplicated already in our collection. That's really about it. I mean, if I could get my hands on it, I tried to keep it.
You weren't anxious to keep that bust of E.W. Scripps,
Oh,
however.
no. Randall came to me and he said, in the lobby of the Rocky, there was this bust, 700 pounds or something
like that, yes.
of Scripps, the founder. And he asked me, do you want this? And I said, no. There is another piece to all of this, and I think you probably could pick it up, certainly from Randall and maybe from me, is that this period of time was incredibly emotional for us. One night, Randall had left. I wasn't watching the clock, and I was still packing up, and I found myself in the newsroom all alone, realizing that at 7:30 in the evening, if the Rocky was still in existence, it would be a buzz of activity. And running into the former employees who were coming by periodically and seeing how they looked and what they were experiencing was, for us, emotionally draining.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'd like you to mention about your last video. It was the day of your closing. You all produced a video that was a remarkable documentary. It's done spontaneously, moving, and I think it's something for the ages. And I think you should. I'd love to have you tell other people about it.
Well, we had a very gifted video and photography staff there, and I think some of this was started in advance, of course, because it was already ready to go on the day of the last paper, and it's called The Last Edition, and it's basically conversations with some of the employees who were there and how they took this news and what they were going to do with the rest of their life. And you could still see it on on Vimeo or YouTube, I believe that there's still live links to that as well, and you can still look for the last edition Rocky Mountain News and see it, but it's a very sad story. I mean, I can't even watch it anymore, but it's a very touching story of what this did to people's lives when you close an institution like this that people had put so much of themselves into. So I think it was a very worthy project, and just amazingly prescient of our staff who was doing this as they were being asked to leave, essentially. So I really tip my hat to the efforts of people and newspaper staff who came together to produce this great final product before they were going out the door.
Yes.
Actually, I'm a Rocky reporter.
Wait.
Yeah, I'm just sorry. I'm Mark Wilson. I'm a former Rocky reporter, but I just wondered what would have been Plan B if the Denver Public Library hadn't stepped forward.
It's a very good question. I don't know that there was a Plan B. We were lucky to have Plan A.
Yeah, there was no other thought. I mean, we were taking the archives. And fortunately for me, in the administrative setup that we have at the Denver Public Library, even though I'm a middle manager, I could make that decision on my own.
Wait.
Thank you.
Wait just a minute.
Thank you all for your sharing your case study and experience of archiving the Rocky Mountain News. Do you have any, I don't know, public response or impact or outcomes to report since you've acquired this archive, and maybe how people are applying it?
It's not live yet, so I can't address that. What I can say is that almost from the beginning, the Denver Post picked up the story that the library was getting the Rockies archives. And what I made sure that whenever I talked to anyone in the field of journalism outside of Denver, I mentioned that we were getting the Rocky archives. And part of that was deliberate on my part, very deliberate, to make sure I kept Scripps' feet to the fire and that they would come through. And they did. The other thing that it did is that the former employees of the Rocky were absolutely elated that we were going to keep their archives. That, I think, has done us a tremendous amount of goodwill. And throughout the community, there is this sense, wow, isn't it great that this major corporation back east decided to give the library, our archives.
Two questions. One I think very quick. Given that goodwill from the former employees towards the Denver Library for taking care of this material, and connecting that back to your conversations about your earlier notes about the difficulties of bringing in this material and sorting through it without help from the folks at the paper, especially the IT folks. Did you make any attempt to kind of reach out to former employees and say, you know, could you come in and give us an afternoon or a day and help us understand this material so that we can ingest it and take care of it better? Sort of reach out to them as potential volunteers, if you will?
Not in the formal way that you described, but what I did have over time was meeting several former employees, and that gave me an opportunity to strike up conversations about them and ask them about their role in the operations.
Okay. The second question, and I realize this is a tiny bit unfair because none of you can really speak for Scripps. To what extent, you know, they I think did the right thing here, genuinely, and probably actually had to make some honest investment to see it through. How have they handled it going forward? I mean, have they talked about this as a an exemplar of corporate responsibility as a potential model that other publishers might follow or that they might follow for, future situations like this? Or did they just sort of make this one-off decision and don't talk about it very much?
I don't know that they've done a public relations campaign to talk about their gifting the archives to the library. But I do know, is that I have no problem in contacting their attorney, and I recently did so within the last month, and ask for his opinion or his help with something.
Yeah, and I was just going to say in response to your question about what's happened since, there was a recent scholarly article that looked at measures of civic engagement before and after the closure of the newspaper, and it demonstrated lower civic engagement after the loss of that newspaper. So it's not just an impact in the newspaper field, it's an impact in the community overall.
And in case you haven't observed, the Denver Post keeps getting smaller and smaller. Its staff is shrinking, and they even moved into smaller physical quarters this last year.
So we've talked, or you guys have talked about the archiving and movement of the physical archives. You've talked about moving the digital archives and putting those in OCLC's content DM. What are you doing about preservation, meaning long-term sustainability of the collections, and what are your preservation policies? How are you organizing that? It's an unusual thing right now in public libraries, and I think you guys are a tremendous exemplar just for taking it in. But now what?
We estimate that it would, for the physical archives, it would cost us around $1 million to treat them according to archival standards. I mean, sleeving all of the photographs, all of the negatives, identifying everything, in addition to managing the actual papers themselves from John Temple's office, et cetera. Currently we have volunteers working on indexing all of the print photographs as well as the clippings files. So that's step one for us. We also have to step back as a staff and recognize and identify those things that we need to still accomplish. And that's where we're hoping someday to be able to submit to the Scripps Foundation a grant proposal.
Yeah, can I actually, just as a follow-up, I wasn't clear, I'm sorry, but the digital preservation component of this is what I'm really, given the topical area that we're studying today.
Right. So with our contract with Content DM and OCLC, we do host, or actually we have two different parts of that. We have the hosting that we pay for because we don't host them on our own servers. So we pay for that. Then it's in the digital archives, and we depend on them to make sure that everything's okay with redundancies and such. So we're paying for that. We trust them. And that's the best you can do, I think, in that case, and actually just check on it as we can.
The wild card is always the ASCII files held by Newsbank, because we don't know if we're going to renew that contract in another year. And if we didn't, we could always put the ASCII files on our own servers. That's pretty manageable.
Am I going to need a library card in order to be able to access this as a non-Coloradan? Okay.
Public is our middle name.
However, I would add something about that. You can access it, you can look at them, you can download them, but they're going to be low image or low resolution images. So you can use them in reports, in PowerPoints, but if you wanted to use them in a commercial way, you would have to pay usage fees. So
you all began this process with the demise of the newspaper. Given your experience with that, could you see a responsibility for the library working with the local newspaper to take over the archiving responsibilities while the newspaper was still alive and undergoing it.
I think it's a great idea to look at in the future. I know we didn't think of it. I mean, December Scripps told us that they were putting the paper up for sale, which generally means you're going to close soon. And by February, we were closed, so there wasn't a lot of time, at least in that frame of mind, to do that. But I think that's certainly a great thing for institutions to look at. I mean, in our case, we did have one time have librarians on staff and people who helped with the physical files. And as cutbacks go, when the paper closed, we had no library staff. We had stacks of stuff that no one really maintained. And so maybe that is a solution going forward, to engage a local library to do that task for you.
The Denver Post has been selling its archive of photographs on eBay. So I don't think they have a strong commitment to doing that. And someone informed me that they saw one day one of our photographs on eBay being sold, and so I wondered, well, what's going on here? So for $15, I bought the photograph, only to find out that it came from the Denver Post. It was a copy print that we had graciously given the Denver Post to publish for one of its articles, and I bought it back. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. Someone with great foresight should be doing that. I'm not sure that there's a will in many companies to make that happen, especially when they're looking at their bottom line.
What advice would any of you have for startup news organizations like ProPublica, Texas Tribune, or others to make their news, make their content in a more preservation-friendly fashion? Randall, I think you mentioned that sometimes in the hurry to meet a deadline, metadata was simply duplicated across photographs. Is it even possible to add enough enough metadata to news stories that will help in its preservation in future?
Well, I think it is, and I think part of the issue is you're talking about organizations that are digital media. They're online, they're websites, and all the newspapers started out as being newspapers, and then there's this web thing comes along, we have to do that as well. And so it's still been a very large ship to turn in the water to get people from thinking about we're putting something out in print to we have this digital thing that needs to be archived and saved forever, and we need to think of it different ways, and we need to keyword it, and we need to be descriptive. And so it's a different kind of challenge. I think maybe there's a better chance of doing that if you're starting out, that all you're doing is purely digital content. But there's still a lot of work to be done as you go. And of course you have the challenges of, the website changes every hour, every half hour, every 15 minutes if you're CNN. So, I mean, there's an awful lot of considerations to do that, but I think it's definitely worth doing.
What do you think is the likelihood of it happening?
I think if it costs money, it's going to be awfully tough. I think that's the big challenge, is the news is so tied to monetization, and I know people are trying to make a living, but at some point there has to be some kind of sense of history or sense of preservation that goes beyond, can we make a buck on this at this moment?
Hey guys, I'm wondering how willing you would have been to do a deal like this if Scripps had wanted some kind of back-end compensation. Let's say that give it to you up front, but say if you make if you turn this into revenue, then you have to give us 33%. Would that have changed the whole calculus?
For me, no. The main thing is that I wanted the Rocky Mountain News in the library for the future. I mean, that's the bottom line. But I will say this, there was another chapter to all of this, and it explains why it took 4 years. Initially, the draft of the agreement was such that the person who bought the URL, Mr. Anschutz, wanted to make sure that if he started the Rocky up again, that the library would provide the archival services to make that happen. In order to do that, our attorney began to put into the agreement that Scripps needed to give us X amount of money to make sure that we could have the photos and the web page and everything else archived within a short period of time. So it was actually on Scripps' shoulders at that point to come up with funds to give the library to make the archives accessible. Once Anschutz was not forthcoming after a year or two, Scripps decided to just move forward. And to their credit, I understand they had a conversation because Anschutz, again, wanted to buy the archives. And Scripps said, no, we have to uphold our part of the deal. That's why in our agreement, it says specifically that the library has the sole discretion as to how it's going to roll out the archives.
Other questions? Martin?
So, given how highly we ranked awareness, in the previous exercise, what, if you have any ideas, maybe Randy or anybody, because a lot of the questions you're asking about, well, what would you have done differently? They go to the question of digital preservation, readiness, and succession planning. And it's obvious that, newspapers are struggling to, survive. They have, the bottom line every day. They have production deadlines, so forth. It's hard to get, somebody that's that busy or worse, at the tail end of it, the drowning situation to focus on, well, handoffs, transition planning, succession planning, all that. What kinds of efforts could you imagine, to broaden the awareness of that need in other newspapers these days? Because, I think, it's no secret the newspaper industry is struggling as a whole. This kind of awareness, this succession planning issue, somehow needs to be brought to the awareness of newspapers, of all the newspapers out there. Can you think of any thoughts on that, or do you have any ideas to share on that?
Well, I think it goes back to you have to make some investment in the business you have. We can't just cut till there's nothing left. And maybe some of that answer is, we create better technology. We use software and technology that can capture your web pages, that can capture information and archive them properly. So in the future, it's a little easier to hand those off or to preserve them and not just go on the way we're doing now, which doesn't seem to be the exact way. Keep our eye on the fact that we have a digital future. We want to digitally archive things and create our product in that way so that it works better. And then, most of us have a will. We plan for when we're going to die. It's a horrible thing to say, but you have to look at your legacy. If you're a publishing industry, what is your legacy of your business? And how is that going to be carried on? And just give some thought and priority to that.
Martin, I'd like to address that from the other side. There are other countries that now have in place, I'll just say, born digital legal deposit laws that allow an institution in that country to legally, it mandates legally that they have to archive websites, news, and they can ask the publisher to comply. That's not universal, but it's happens, for example, in Denmark and Estonia.
I think another important part of this is the sort of actions of the librarians who are bringing this in. And if you didn't go to that cocktail party and talk to the editor, maybe this never would have happened. And I think we have to think about acquiring these things more like a real special collections where we're going out there and talking to the decision makers at the local papers, talking to the decision makers that could really make projects like this not just one-offs, but if librarians could see themselves as sort of actively acquiring and not passively waiting for them to come, I think that could help too.
You're absolutely right. Something that my colleagues and I are trying to do is to be more proactive in the collections that we obtain. However, getting back to your comment earlier, it's human nature not to think about archiving your papers. So if I were to ask any of you and say, I would like each of you to give your papers to the Denver Public Library, how many of you would have your papers well organized to do so overnight? And most people don't. And that may be something that's kind of a big task to put even on a newspaper as large as the Rocky was in its time. I can't tell you that this is a very typical situation for us. Oftentimes we get the call and goes something like this: we're moving next week. Could you please come to our house? And that's oftentimes how we get the collections. There are sometimes organizations and people who have foresight and begin to work with us years in advance, but oftentimes it's at the 11th hour.
And it's not just newspapers. You know, there's corporations that are cutting, the first thing they cut is archivists and librarians. So there goes their archives, there goes their library, and they start throwing away their materials. And so some of these are old corporations that have also important papers and important information, not just newspapers. So it's bye-bye.
All right. Could I ask a quick question about preservation? In this extensive contract that you have with Newsbank, are there provisions about the long-term preservation of the content that they hold for you?
5 years for a 5-year negotiation for a 3-year agreement?
Yeah, and actually the agreement was post-dated.
So
it was signed this last year, but it ends next year.
It's my impression that Newsbank, ProQuest, LexisNexis, none of them have a preservation policy in place.
They have the responsibility to maintain our data. That's clear in the agreement. What we inserted into the agreement was that if anything went wrong, Newsbank folded, it was sold, or we did not renew the contract, that they would indeed give us the ASCII files. That was our main concern. They also, by the way, have all of our microfilm, the masters.
We have one last question.
Well, it's just sort of a comment, and to Randall's point, planning, a lot of us believe very firmly in planning and in planning for the future, but many of our companies are not necessarily owned by the traditional media companies anymore. They're owned by investment firms. And the eye isn't necessarily towards that. It's about investment. It's about the bottom line. So planning for the future, you have to have a very enlightened group of leaders, whether it's the news organizations or private companies, because a lot of what's happening for us is that this is all going to investment companies who are making the call on, you know, who's working, how we're going to do things, not just today, but next month. And it sometimes isn't planned any further than that, on that cheery note.
I'd like to thank the 3 people from the Denver Public Library and the Rocky Mountain News for Q&A.